It was great to hear from a profound brother from Detroit beforehand. I am a child of my mom born in Detroit. Detroit gave my family a pathway out of the middle class, out of the poverty rather, and I'm grateful. My grandfather worked on the assembly lines there and became a union organizer, one of the first African Americans in that community. So I'm just proud and grateful that you are standing up for Detroit. And I'm sick and tired of cities being used as punchlines to jokes on late night talk show hosts and not sources of inspiration. I'm a little fired up right now. Thank you for the smattering of applause from this section right here and the snapping. I saw a snapper there. This is now my favorite section of the entire audience. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm a little fired up right now, and I'm almost embarrassed that I'm fired up right now because there was a shooting on my block a day before yesterday, and it bothers me that triggered my fired up because there's shootings on blocks in America every single day. There are people being murdered in our city, in our country, every single day, and we have normalized it. I love the mission statement of this gathering. I mean, I love it. Its words echo with me. But I want to read the first part, which is the only sentence I take issue with, which is, "These are not normal times in America." And then the mission goes on about what we're doing here. But to say that the election of Donald Trump ushered in an abnormal time is what sort of gets me upset. So I am proud, as Andrew said, to still live in that same neighborhood when you met me, still live in that same community. I lived in the projects, the high-rise projects that were there for 8 years. But of all the 100 senators, and I love some of my colleagues dearly, frankly, I try to love all my colleagues, so I like some of my colleagues dearly. I love them all. But I return to an inner city when I come home. I return to a community below the poverty line. I return to a community where the median income is $14,000 per household. Think about that for a second. I live in a community where hearing gunshots is not abnormal. And unfortunately, I live in a community like Detroit and others where you walk around and you see sidewalk shrines on a regular basis to folk who've been murdered. And they're disproportionately African American young men. I've been to too many funerals watching people mourn and grieve over what has become normalized in America. When Mamie Till kept the casket open so folk could see Emmett Till's brutalized body, it seemed like the world stopped. But now the carnage in our communities is going on every single day, and we don't stop. And so gunshots ring in my community. And what fires me up is that we have the capacity to stop it as a nation, but we do things and allow things to happen in our names that continues to drive levels of injustice in this area seen nowhere else on the planet Earth. In America, we have carnage that belongs in war zones that goes on in our own streets, in our own communities, usually poor communities and communities of color. The majority of gun owners, overwhelming, agree on simple steps that could stop folk from getting guns in their hands, like background checks, closing loopholes that allow criminals to get guns, but we don't act on it. In states that have, you see percentages, for example, of women who are murdered by their intimates go down dramatically. We know it makes a difference, but we can't pass that legislation, not because of some folk in Washington that refuse to do it. Please, we were able to pass civil rights legislation. The longest filibuster in Senate history is not Ted Cruz. The longest filibuster in Senate history is a racist rant by Strom Thurmond But we pass civil rights legislation because of the truth that change doesn't come from Washington. It comes to Washington by people that demand it. Something else happened that could change the reality is just in my community, and communities all across the country, we've allowed our country in just since the 1980s to become the incarceration capital of the globe. Literally, we now in America have about 4% of the globe's population, but 1 out of every 4 incarcerated people on the planet Earth are in America. And this is a dark, cancerous shame that hangs over our country that's become normalized. So outrageous, so despicable, that it mocks the words that we say, liberty and justice for all, that we all put our hands on our hearts and pledge an oath to. And yet we tolerate injustices that other countries call torture. When we round up children and put them in places like Rikers Island, shoving them in solitary confinement, which we have a consensus amongst our psychological community that we should not be doing that. And who do we incarcerate in this country? I grew up in, compared to Newark, a relatively affluent community. We were the first black family to move in. Senior cut day, friends of mine went to go with a fake ID to buy some alcohol, place was closed, kicked in the back door, stole some liquor or some beer. They were caught. The right thing happened. Fathers got involved. Things were taken care of. Those guys are doing great. I know them. They're doing great in life now. That's the right outcome. Same thing happens in an urban community. What happens to those kids? But let's talk even more bluntly about drugs. I went to Stanford. I tell you right now, there are all kinds of drug use going on. Adderall, ecstasy, pot, cocaine, all kind of drug use. There is no difference in America between blacks, whites, and Latinos for using drugs or dealing drugs. In fact, some studies show that young white men deal drugs a little bit more than young black men. Harvard has a study, picture a drug dealer, 95% of Americans, black and white, picture somebody black. And if you're black in America, you will be incarcerated almost 4 times more likely for the use of drugs. Nobody's setting up stop and frisks. Nobody's setting up sting operations on college campuses. And so here we have this nation of hypocrisy where 2 of our last 3 presidents copped to felony drug use. Not a little marijuana, felony drug use. But yet we're sticking people in prisons and jails at unconscionable rates for doing things that half of Congress has probably done. And when they get there, we torture with solitary confinement our children. And then when they come out, we disempower them because in this country, you can't get a Pell Grant, you can't get business licenses, loans from banks, food stamps, public housing. In fact, the American Bar Association has seen 40,000 collateral consequences they've documented that you can't do if you've been arrested for something that presidents and congresspeople and senators do. And this is normal in America. And what does it do to communities like mine, or Chicago, or Detroit? What does it do when you walk my streets and just about 50% of the black men have been churned into a merciless system? Whereas Brian Stevenson says you get treated better in America if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. Where you're held like kids right now in Rikers Island for 6 months, a year, 18 months before you even get a trial. And a trial? We need to wake up, folks. We don't have the criminal justice system of our parents. Trials and juries and judges. 98% of criminal convictions now are done by plea bargain. Why? Because we've ratcheted up legislatures, more mandatory minimums, prosecutors have more leverage. I've had kids in my office that said, hey, I was told this was the deal. That I could just take the charge right now, prosecutor gets another conviction, I get right out with a criminal felony offense on my record now, and forget college, forget businesses, forget all the things I mentioned before. Or if I try to fight this, they're going to put me in adult court, stack those charges, I'll be facing 20 years. What deal do you take if you're 17 years old? Well, there's a great book, you should read it, Why Innocent People Plead Guilty in a System Like This to Nonviolent Drug Offenses. And we're here in a personal democracy forum. Let me tell you right now, Florida went a different way in the last election. We'd be saying, hello, President Clinton. But you know what? 1 out of 5 black people in Florida cannot vote because of felony disenfranchisement. Think about those numbers. Study came out, Vanderbilt University, I think it was Vanderbilt, if we had the same incarceration rates as our industrial peers, we'd have 20% less poverty in America. What does it do to children of incarcerated adults? You want to cry tonight? At least I did when I saw it. Go home and just put in Sesame Street, children of incarcerated adults, to see that there are so many hundreds of thousands of kids in America growing up with a parent in prison that they now have programming directed towards them. So yeah, fine. Donald Trump is president, and I'm angry, and he is hurting people. But don't tell me that this is now the beginning of a time that's not normal. And I'll end with this. It is a call to the ideals of love. It is us in this room that has to prick the consciousness of our brothers and sisters, wake up the moral imagination of a country, and say there is so much that is not right, that your suffering is my suffering, that your cause is my cause, because this is still the United States of America, one nation, one destiny. And we got to wake people up. I am in politics because there are too many people being left behind. And I've traveled the country now visiting communities that we don't even know how we're participating in the suffering of others. Just down in North Carolina. Sat down with a group of African Americans right before Obama left office. It wasn't normal what these folks were facing. A community where one guy who went to the Vietnam War said he left to go to the Vietnam War, comes back in his own community, he's a prisoner. Why? Well, because we love our bacon in America. 9 million pigs in North Carolina. Pigs produce 10 times the refuse that humans do. And while New Jersey has 9 million people, we've got waste treatment plants. They don't have that for pigs. Massive lagoons of refuse that the big companies, one of the largest of which, a Chinese company, moved into poor black communities with their lagoons of pig crap, and they spray it over fields. I watched as it misted into neighborhoods. The respiratory problems, the cancers. We're talking about election in 2018. We vote every day with our dollars. And so there's a whole lot that's not normal in America. And it didn't start with the toxicity that was elected President of the United States. And so we've got to wake each other up. There is suffering that should not be. Poverty rates that when I just came back from Europe, that people scratched their head and said, how do you have a country that is the richest on the planet Earth and has 20% of your children living in poverty? People that don't understand, when I was sharing with them stories of my neighbors who don't have paid sick leave when every industrialized country does, and they have to make decisions about leaving their job to be there with their kids that have asthma. And by the way, asthma is epidemic. Why? In urban areas, because of the environment is toxic, companies that have outsourced their costs on the most vulnerable of people. So I'm still that guy that Andrew met. I'm not leaving my city, not leaving my community. That's why the brother got me so charged up. I'm happy that I get to fight in Washington every day, but I still remember standing up in my caucus when thousands of people were marching because of what happened in Ferguson and just saying, how can we not understand and have more urgency and fight when we've rendered so many communities invisible that somehow we indulge in the worst type of privilege. I'm guilty of this. That if there's an urgent problem out there, but it's not affecting me and my family, then it's actually not that urgent of a problem. We have work to do in this country, and my hope is groups like this who have so much power. Remember, Alice Walker said the most common way people give up their power is not realizing they have it in the first place. So much power to get folk woke, to remind people that this cause is greater than any person in office, that the power of the people is greater than the people in power, that there's nothing we can't do, that our history in this country is a perpetual testimony to the achievement of the impossible, and there are people right now mourning their murdered son who feel like this country does not give a damn. We've got to stand up and say your problems may seem impossible, but we are here together in this. We will transform our country and finally be the generation that makes real that promise that we will be a country of liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so we're cutting that line out of our manifesto. So Cory, I'm not going to ask you to match the gender, we're a gender equal conference. I'm not going to ask you to match Senator Gillibrand's use of a 4-letter word this morning, which is now all over the internet.
She's one of my best friends in the Senate. And she is unbelievably effective. And again, I told you why I got into politics, for folks being left behind. The fights that she's picked up for gay and lesbian Americans, the fights that she's picked up for
first responders. I mean, I can go through, she and I are on rape victims.
She and I are on marijuana legislation, trying to get the federal government, get in line with where the states are going. So I just love her. She's an amazing woman, amazing American, amazing patriot.
So thank you for that. I think we handed out some index cards, so if you have some questions, jot them down. Mika and some of our staff will pick them up, and I'll try to get through them as fast as I can. But I just want to quickly remind you, I don't know if you remember this, but I introduced you to then Congressman Gillibrand.
Oh my gosh.
Because I came to your office in Newark, and she had just signed a punch clock pledge,
yes,
where she was posting her schedule online.
Yes, I remember you telling me that. I definitely remember.
And I said, can I introduce you to Kirsten Gillibrand? And I did. So when the two of you are running for president and vice president, I'm not saying which one's going to be where, who's going to be on top. I'm expecting an invitation to the inaugural because I introduced the two of you guys.
At this point, Kirsten might drop an F-bomb on that.
Well, actually, I didn't ask her that question, but there were a lot of people in the audience who did ask her when she's running, and I think a lot of people would like to see it. And I think, just going back to your talk, I think we're all inspired to hear the passion in your voice. I think that this particular audience is actually trying very, very hard to use the words that they've heard from you, not just today, but before, and from some other leaders, and put it into action, but not in the form of all the attempts in the past, but one that's commensurate with our technological reality, as well as maybe it's not normal, but we have some new political realities and some new challenges that are more visible and more obvious. And one of the talks yesterday, one of the great examples that was said was that we should not be talking about post-traumatic stress, we should be talking about post-traumatic growth, and how we can use this moment to actually grow and create something better than what we tried to do in the past. So I want you to answer, if you could, for me, how we marry your passionate call to action so that we don't repeat the same things that were said before, because those calls for actions have been said before, Cory. And so we have a new generation that's trying to figure out how to go beyond that, and so maybe you can link the two.
Well, I mean, the thing that gets me, King said it more eloquently than I could, that the problem today, he said, what we'll have to repent for is not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. And that's really where I get frustrated, but I know how great capacity we have to activate and engage people. But look, I say this all the time. I tell people about 2008, going to vote, line around my building, going up to the end of the line. This is Newark, we're real with each other. Woman on the end of the line doesn't say, hey, Mayor, how are you doing? She looks at me and she says, don't you think you're cutting in this line now? I don't care who you are. And I looked at her and I'm the mayor. I had a police officer next to me. I go, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I'm definitely. But no, my point is that the next year, I go to vote in the gubernatorial election and nobody was there. I walked right in, I hugged the poll worker because she looked lonely, and I voted. And my state, not because of some surge in Republican voters, but a massive decline in Democratic voters, we elected Chris Christie. And everybody wants to now get mad at him, which, you know, again, I have a great working relationship with him, but there's a lot of reasons to be mad at him. Cutting earned income tax credit, pulling out our regional greenhouse gas agreements, cutting funding to Planned Parenthood. I can go through my list, I can write a dissertation on it. But the reality is the challenge for us was not about what he did, it's what we didn't do. And so I look at the turnout results, I look at folks who were not engaged, and I don't understand now that they're bemoaning the realities that you know, Brian Stevenson, again, who's my hero, second time I'm mentioning him, he's like, he recorded this amazing video right before the campaign. He's like, I don't understand how people who say, well, I'm choosing the lesser between two evils. Like, he's like, the black community's had to do that for generations. And he goes, people don't understand the outcome of this election will be life or death for the kind of people I represent. And with Jeff Sessions now as our Attorney General, and them turning their back as a Justice Department on so many of the critical issues, I don't think he was exaggerating or being melodramatic. So that's really, to me, the challenge is, I mean, in many ways, when Trump leaves, I worry that we won't have the same kind of engagement and motivation to do what we need to do, flipping Congress, flipping state houses, driving a progressive agenda. And that's the only thing I know how to get that done is sustained engagement. And that's the trick, that's the question, but it's also the secret to why things like the civil rights movement showed such success.
So, Senator, one of the challenges to sustain engagement is to make sure that everybody has access to information. And as you know, the FCC is moving to start the process of dismantling net neutrality.
Right.
And the question actually is that the average age of senators is 61. I can't believe I'm going to actually say this joke. Politicians usually don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. It's still true. How many of your colleagues really understand technology and its role in democracy?
Well, first of all, I could tell about Chairman Pai's movements and how we don't have many tools to stop him. There's already been like 4+ million public comments. The overwhelming majority of them have been to stop the action that I know is inevitable. I think he's already made his mind up. But look, there's generational changes happening. I think that's important. But again, I am so excited about technology's implications for the way we are going to govern as a society. It changed the way I govern as mayor. It enabled me to find new ways to get engaged. So I agree with you, there's a massive problem right now about not just the FCC. I can go through the EPA. I can go through all of the departments that I see up close and personal. I mean, just the Department of Education and what they're going to be doing to devastate progress that we've made around civil rights and inclusiveness in our public schools. So I hurt over this. We're going to live with these consequences. I don't know what we can do. By the way, people should go online. People should file their comments. Let's break records for people lifting their voice. Let's let people know there will be consequences should they end net neutrality. But I just want to urge everybody that this is going to be a tough 2 years. Painfully tough 2 years. And now less than that. I should be counting down the clock till we have a chance to change our federal government. and to do something like flip the House. And by the way, we flipped the House, we changed the equation. We flipped the House, I think after testimony yesterday, impeachment proceedings would have already been at least filed. So that's what's at stake here for the House races that are up and the consequences that we're going to have to deal with for the next 18 months or so.
So this might be a little bit of a tough question. So
I hope you don't filter out only the nice ones.
So the tough one is that you mentioned, so African Americans disproportionately didn't vote in the same numbers that they did for Barack Obama in the last election.
There was a painful drop, and over 10% in many of the states, just in turnout alone. It was painful.
And so what's going to get them to come out for the midterms and to help us flip the House?
Well, I mean, for one, we've got to start having more honest conversations about issues that affect America as a whole, and particularly the black community. If Comey could step up and talk about a speech, I included parts of it in my book, he stepped up and talked about implicit racial bias in policing. And yet we still can't have a conversation as a country about the urgency to have equal justice under the law, which we do not have in this country right now, because we're not dealing with these issues in the way that we should. And so I understand that, look, they were targeting with impressive and insidious sophistication things towards African Americans to suppress their vote. If I saw one more time the super predator quote that Secretary Clinton made in the 90s, the way they were finding young black people in states like Pennsylvania and targeting them, all of that stuff is going on. But despite it all, the question we have to say is, how are we going to react? And for me, I'm so happy I'm the fourth elected African-American, popularly elected African-American in the history of the United States Senate. And to me, that's outrageous that it's been so few. And I'm hoping that we can have, and I've been fighting in the Senate along with people like Brian Schatz, just to make the Senate itself more diverse. I'm proud that I'm pretty much a majority-minority staff. But we see staffs, people that are, Hamilton in the room when it happens. We don't have a very diverse folks in rooms where the policy is being made. And so we've got to show every community, whether it's rural white community, urban black community, that we not only have the head, the policy for you, but we have a heart and we care. And the issues that are important to you and your families are right front and center.
Well, if you see any of them over your travels, please invite them to come and connect with us here, because we want to make sure that whatever ideas they have, whatever words they have, and their connections to their communities are part of the infrastructure that's being built to be able to take back the House and take back the Senate and, frankly, take back our country. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.